So, if you want to understand all these massive demographic and cultural shifts making headlines in places like London, Paris, or New York today,
which is, constantly in the news.
Right, constantly. You actually shouldn't be looking at modern border policies. You need to look at a Roman road built over 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, which sounds crazy, but it's true.
Because if you're someone who watches the daily news, the culture clashes, the shifting populations, and you just feel this overwhelming sense of chaos, or like things are changing in completely unprecedented ways.
Absolutely. It feels like a storm.
Exactly. Well, you might just be looking at the symptoms while completely ignoring the underlying physics of history. Today, we are promising you a massive aha moment.
A really big one.
Yeah, one that takes all the noisy, seemingly random events of the modern world and connects them directly to this deeply predictable rhythm that basically began in the ancient world.
I mean, it is entirely natural to feel disoriented by the sheer velocity of global events right now.
Oh, for sure.
When you're living through history day by day, it rarely feels like a neat, organized timeline. Like I said, it feels like a storm. But the framework we are examining today offers this profound shift in perspective.
Right.
It zooms out far enough to reveal that what we perceive as random, unprecedented chaos is actually a very defined historical mechanism, and it's playing out right on schedule.
And the lens we are using for this deep dive is this truly thought-provoking video essay by Johann Kasim. It's titled Roman versus British Empire, Part 1.
Highly recommend checking it out. Yeah.
Definitely. And our mission today is to explore Kasim's central, honestly incredibly compelling thesis, which is that empires do not simply disappear when their time is up.
No, they don't just fold up their flags and vanish.
Exactly. They leave behind these structural ghosts. They set off historical chain reactions that could take centuries to fully play out. So, okay, let's unpack this by starting with the ultimate historical benchmark, right? The blueprint for all of this, ancient Rome.
Rome is the perfect starting point. I mean, it establishes what we can basically call the pattern of empire.
Mm-hmm.
Because when people think about the fall of the Roman Empire, they tend to visualize ruins, right?
Like broken marble columns.
Exactly. Crumbling aqueducts, vanished legions. They think of a very definitive ending. But Kasim argues that empires, they do not just evaporate into the ether.
Right.
They leave behind an infrastructure that fundamentally outlasts their political power. So Rome left behind literal roads, obviously.
Yeah, famous ones.
But they also left behind languages, deep-seated beliefs, and this comprehensive system of law, order, and meaning.
So they didn't just conquer territory, they paved the environment itself.
Yes.
And the crucial example here, the ultimate ghost of the Roman Empire, is Christianity.
Oh, this is the perfect example.
Right, because it is so easy to forget that Christianity did not start in Rome. It began as this tiny, marginalized Eastern faith on the absolute fringes of the empire, way out in Judea. Early on, it was practically invisible to the emperors sitting in the capital.
And that is the core paradox of imperial power, honestly. Rome spent centuries building this vast, interconnected, heavily policed system.
Right.
And they did this to maintain strict control, facilitate military movement, and obviously trade. So they laid down miles of those famous Roman roads.
And they actively cleared the Mediterranean Sea of pirates.
Right.
Just to secure shipping lanes.
Exactly. They established common tongues like Latin in the West, Greek in the East, just for seamless commerce and administration. They built this incredible, highly efficient machine for dominance.
But the thing about a well-built machine is that it doesn't really care who's operating it, does it?
Not at all.
It just runs.
Precisely. Because of Rome's vast interconnected system, this small Eastern faith was able to travel safely and rapidly, straight into the very heart of the empire.
Wow.
Right. Missionaries could walk on roads protected by Roman guards. They could sail on seas cleared by the Roman navy, and they could preach in a language understood in literally every marketplace, from Syria to Spain.
Let me try to visualize this mechanically for a second. Think of Rome's infrastructure, the roads, shipping lanes, the legal frameworks. Think of it as modern computer hardware.
Okay, I like that.
Rome spent centuries building the most advanced, robust hardware on the planet, specifically designed to run their imperial program, right? Tax collection, troop deployment, extracting resources.
Right.
But then Christianity comes along, and Christianity essentially became this highly viral software that just happened to run flawlessly on Rome's hardware.
Oh, that's a great way to frame it.
The roads that were meant for marching legions became the exact same roads used by individuals carrying epistles. The state courier systems were inadvertently used to network early churches. So, did the very tools Rome used to conquer the world eventually end up conquering Rome culturally?
What's fascinating here is the sheer unintentionality of it all. Rome didn't build the roads to spread a subversive new religion.
Yeah.
I mean, they built them to move weapons and wealth. But systems of order inherently become highways for new ideas. Kassim makes a critical point here that completely reframes European history, which is that European Christendom was not born outside of the Roman Empire.
It didn't mass on the borders and conquer Rome from the outside?
Exactly. It was incubated completely inside it. The empire created the exact logistical conditions necessary for its own cultural transformation.
That's wild.
The conqueror, just by the very act of conquering and connecting, lays the groundwork for the conqueror to eventually reshape the conqueror's world.
So, if Rome proves that physical infrastructure inevitably brings the margins to the center, what happens when an empire's infrastructure isn't made of stone, but of water?
Yes.
Because once you understand this hardware and software dynamic, you realize it doesn't just stop with antiquity, it scales up. And that leads us directly into the British Empire to see how this exact same pattern evolved on a global oceanic level.
Yeah, the shift in scale here is just staggering. Rome was primarily a terrestrial empire, right? Ruling a continuous landmass around the Mediterranean. Britain, on the other hand, was a maritime empire.
Right.
It ruled oceans. It dominated global trade routes. And because of that unprecedented global reach, it exported not just physical goods or troops, but language, legal frameworks, and essentially modern identity.
Yeah, the source points out that Britain's reach extended incredibly deep into Asia and Africa. And it's crucial to understand the mechanics of this because it wasn't just a smash and grab extraction operation.
No.
I mean, yes, extracting resources was obviously the primary economic driver, but Kassim highlights that the British Empire ended up touching the souls of entire civilizations.
Yeah, that's a powerful phrase.
They exported their parliamentary systems, their sports, their bureaucracy, and, like, most importantly, the English language to every corner of the globe.
They created a global architecture of identity. By implementing their educational systems, their civil service exams, their administrative structures in these vast colonies, they fundamentally rewired the cultural software of billions of people.
Right.
They brought the periphery into the center's way of operating, just like Rome did, but across entire oceans. They standardized the globe to run on British code.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. And I actually have to push back a little bit on this idea of exporting a shared identity.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because the British Empire was notoriously hierarchical. They actively suppressed local cultures in many places, and they kept colonized populations entirely separate from the ruling British class.
That's true.
There were strict racial and social boundaries. So how exactly does a strictly segregated, highly unequal empire end up exporting a shared identity that bridges that gap? I mean, it seems a bit contradictory.
No, that is a highly perceptive challenge. The empire was indeed segregated, but the mechanics of administration actually forced a bridge to be built.
How so?
Well, to run an empire of that magnitude, the British could not simply import enough administrators from London.
Oh, there just weren't enough people.
Exactly. They had to rely on local populations. So they established schools to teach local elites English, British common law, Western administrative practices. They needed clerks, lawyers, soldiers who understood the British system intimately.
Right, okay.
So by doing so, even within a segregated system, they essentially handed over the instruction manual for the empire. They trained an entire class of people who were geographically African or Asian, but administratively and linguistically fluent in British systems.
Okay, so they essentially installed a universal operating system in the colonies just so the empire could function efficiently.
Yes.
But Kassim argues this wasn't a permanent one-way export, right? He describes it as the drawing back of a massive historical bowstring. What is the actual mechanism that causes that bowstring to snap back?
The mechanism is fluency and network access. When you implement the English language and common law across the globe, you are building a deeply interconnected system, much like the Roman roads, but made of shipping lanes, telegraph wires, and a shared bureaucratic language.
Wow, okay.
You have a relatively small island nation embedding its systems into distant cultures. That creates historical tension.
Right.
The colonized populations, who are now fully fluent in the language and systems of the empire, eventually realize they hold the access keys to the wider network.
Yes.
Just as the early Christians utilized Roman roads to travel to Rome, formerly colonized peoples utilized the linguistic and cultural bridges built by the British to move, to trade, to study, and eventually to migrate.
Because they couldn't migrate easily if they didn't know the language or the laws. But the empire itself provided the exact training required to navigate London's bureaucracy centuries later, which brings us directly to the modern day and to really the most provocative part of Kasim's thesis. We are following this return current to explain the major demographic shifts happening in the West right now.
Yes.
The source presents a highly compelling parallel regarding the modern West encountering Islam and other Eastern traditions.
And before we delve into the mechanics of this, we really need to establish the parameters of our discussion here.
Right. Good call. And look, whenever we talk about modern migration to the West, politics instantly enters the chat.
Oh, immediately.
Instantly. But for this deep dive, we are hitting pause on all the modern partisan debates about border policies. We aren't taking a stance on whether current policies are right or wrong, good or bad. We are purely looking at the historical physics of Kasim's framework.
Yes, exactly.
We're just looking at the why and the how behind the macro level human movement.
Precisely. We were examining historical cause and effect. And Kasim provides a profoundly summarizing quote to explain the presence of migrating populations in the West. It's a single powerful sentence. We are here because you were there first.
We are here because you were there first.
Yeah.
That completely reframes the narrative. Kasim is arguing that modern migration is not a random phenomenon. Historically speaking, it isn't an invasion or an inexplicable crisis out of nowhere. It is a predictable historical return current.
He argues that the presence of Islam and Eastern traditions in Europe today simply cannot be separated from the centuries of European imperial expansion into those very lands. You cannot decouple the outward expansion from the inward return.
So let's ground this in the mechanics we just talked about. Let's think about it like network architecture. The British Empire, and well, European empires in general, spent centuries going out into the world, mapping the global network, and basically distributing access. Forced their languages, their economic systems, and their political structures onto distant populations. That was the outward expansion. What we are experiencing right now in the West is simply the users logging into the main server.
Yes.
The populations who were given the access keys are now using them to travel back along the very network the West built. Like, you can't be surprised when people log into a network you spent centuries forcing them to join.
That analogy perfectly captures the causality. The energy put into the system is returning along the pathways created by that very energy. And this brings Kasim's ultimate parallel into sharp focus.
Right.
Just as ancient Rome received Christianity from the East through the physical and linguistic infrastructure it built, the modern West now receives Islam and Eastern traditions through the global, administrative, and linguistic infrastructure it built. To quote the source directly, the empire went out, now the world comes in.
The empire went out, now the world comes in. I mean, when you understand the mechanics behind that, you go from feeling like the sky is falling to realizing, oh, this is just gravity. This is just the physics of history working exactly the way it always has.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals Kasim's underlying philosophy on time and human events.
Oh, yeah.
Because as a society, we suffer from an extreme present bias. We tend to view the events of our own lifetimes, especially cultural shifts or demographic changes, as entirely unique, right? As unprecedented disruptions of some normal state of affairs.
Yeah, we always think we're the first ones to go through it.
Exactly. But Kasim's is demonstrating that what we experience today as unprecedented change is often just history returning to us. It is the completion of a cycle, the snapback of a bowstring that was pulled taut hundreds of years before we were even born.
We started this deep dive talking about that feeling of chaos when you watch the daily news. And that's exactly what Kasim's thesis directly cures. Because the final takeaway from the source, like the core realization we really need to walk away with, is this. Empire never ended. It just changed direction.
It is a completely paradigm-shifting way to view the world. Empires shape the future long after they formally collapse.
Yeah.
The political entities, the specific emperors, the colonial governors, the flags flying over government buildings.
All the stuff that gets written in the history books.
Exactly. Those things eventually disappear. But the grooves they carved into the world, the logistical roads, the shared languages, the administrative operating systems, those remain. And those grooves dictate the flow of human culture, religion, and population for millennia.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this right now? It means that the next time you look at global news or read an article about demographic shifts in major Western cities, you don't have to feel overwhelmed by the noise.
Not at all.
You can step back. You can look for the historical return currents. You can recognize that the interconnected, rapidly shifting world we live in today is the direct mechanical result of the hardware built by empires centuries ago.
Mm-hmm. The new cultural software running on it is just the inevitable result of those connections. Understanding the mechanics changes fear into understanding.
It really replaces a feeling of random chaos with a recognition of deep historical rhythm. It allows you to view the present not as a terrifying aberration, but as a direct, logical, and deeply human continuation of the past.
But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one completely new thought to mull over. Something that builds on Kasim's framework, but applies it to the invisible world we are building right this very second.
Oh, this is fascinating.
Right. Throughout this deep dive, we talked about physical empires. Rome building literal stone roads to move legions, Britain building oceanic trade routes and global bureaucracies. We saw how those physical and administrative infrastructures created massive return currents of culture and faith centuries later.
Yeah, the hardware was built for conquest, but the software that returned on it completely transformed the conquerors. Exactly. Well, think about our modern world. Think about the borderless digital empires we are building today. We have massive tech platforms headquartered in the West, primarily out of places like Silicon Valley, and they are reaching into almost every single smartphone on planet Earth.
Yeah, billions of them.
They're exporting a very specific type of digital culture. They are pushing a very specific algorithm of identity, of commerce, of communication to literally every corner of the globe. That is an outward expansion on a scale and at a speed that makes Rome and Britain look minuscule.
Oh, without a doubt.
So here's the question you need to ask yourself. What kind of return currents are these digital empires creating right now?
It is a staggering thought experiment. If physical roads and wooden ships drew back a historical bowstring, we are currently drawing back a digital bowstring of unimaginable tension. We are handing out network access keys to 8 billion people simultaneously.
So 100 years from now, what new faiths or political movements or fundamental cultural shifts will travel back along our digital trade routes to completely transform the West? It's incredible to think about.
If physical Roman roads brought back an Eastern religion that reshaped Europe, what exactly do algorithmic roads bring back to Silicon Valley? Because remember, history is not a one-way street. The tide always comes back in. You just have to know what kind of water you're watching.
Mm-hmm. Continue on to the next recording, which is part 2. Okay, this is empires in reverse. All right, we're going to part 2.
The year 2026, you're actually standing in Rome, and it's the year 476 AD.
Right, the exact moment the greatest empire in the world collapses.
Yeah, exactly. It's a massive, highly controversial claim. And that is exactly what we are unpacking in today's deep dive.
It really is a staggering premise, isn't it? We're looking at this fascinating theory presented by Johann Kasim. He's a YouTube creator and a massive history enthusiast.
Yeah.
And to build this argument, he doesn't just, look at modern news cycles or whatever. He uses this incredible historical framework known as the longue durée.
The longue durée, which, we usually treat history like a museum,
yeah.
Right? Like isolated artifacts in blue glass cases, a battle over here, a treaty over there.
Always compartmentalized.
Exactly. But the longue durée treats history way more like plate tectonics.
Yeah.
You don't just look at the single earthquake, you look at the centuries of pressure building up beneath the crust.
That's a great way to put it. Kasim is basically asking us to examine these slow, massive shifts of civilizations. We're talking hundreds, even thousands of years.
Yeah.
And he uses that to explain why he believes the British Empire and the Roman Empire are essentially like running the exact same software program.
Which is wild. But, and this is a huge but, applying that tectonic lens to the modern world leads Kasim into some intensely charged political territory.
Oh, absolutely. Very heated stuff.
He makes these sweeping arguments about immigration, what he terms woke culture, border control, a lot of heavy modern issues.
Oh, it really goes there, yeah.
So we need to set a really clear ground rule for you listening right now. Our mission today is just to be your impartial mechanics.
Right, we're just looking at the engine.
Exactly. We are taking this creator's theory, putting it up on the workbench, and just examining the gears.
Yeah.
We are not taking sides here.
No, not at all.
And we are definitely not endorsing any of the political viewpoints presented. We're simply unpacking the architecture of his argument so you can understand exactly how he connects ancient Rome to, modern Britain.
And the foundation of that architecture is actually profoundly personal for him, which is super interesting.
Right, his family history.
Yeah, he actually traces his own royal Southeast Asian bloodline to prove this point. He wants to show that before empires ever collide, they build up these massive historical resumes, like a CV.
I love that concept of an empire having a CV.
Yeah.
So let's look at his resume, right? He claims a direct descent, I think it's 25 to 30 generations from King Wickramadinna.
Right, of the Majapahit Empire in Java.
Yeah. And to really grasp the scale of this long durée thing here, you have to picture what was happening globally during this king's reign. So this is 1389 to 1429, right? Over in Europe, society is just being absolutely devastated by the Black Plague. Entire populations are just collapsing.
It's basically apocalyptic over there.
Exactly. But meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, Qasim's ancestors are running this thriving, colossal, thalassocratic empire.
Thalassocratic, meaning a maritime power, for anyone wondering.
Yes, sea power.
The Majapahit didn't just control the land, they controlled the oceans. They dominated these massive trade routes across this huge network of islands.
Wow.
And crucially, the mechanics of their society were like deeply intertwined with the divine. The source really highlights that they operated under these concepts of Devarja, which means god kings.
Okay.
And Dharmaraja, which translates to righteous kings.
Qasim even talks about seeing statues of his ancestors that were designed as figures of actual worship, right?
Yeah.
Not just like, a political memorial in a park.
Right, literally divine figures. So this isn't just a government, it's a deeply rooted, spiritually reinforced civilization.
Right.
Which means when the British eventually sail into Southeast Asia, centuries later, they aren't stepping into some blank historical void. They are encountering a highly evolved, very complex society.
But the British weren't exactly, novices stepping onto the world stage at that point either, were they?
No, definitely not. By the time they landed in Penang to set up their presence in Malaya, their own imperial CV was heavily, heavily stacked.
Yeah, they had already been busy.
Very. They had already aggressively expanded into India through figures like Robert Clive. They had basically mastered the art of leveraging local internal conflicts to their advantage.
Right, divide and conquer.
Exactly. And Captain Cook had already claimed vast territories down in Australia and New Zealand.
Then you have to add this massive psychological factor to the British CV too. The timing. The United States was officially established just a mere 3 years before the British set foot in Penang.
3 years. That is such a critical mechanism to understand here.
It's crazy.
Right. The British Empire arriving in Southeast Asia is not just experienced, it's bruised.
Yeah, they just got kicked out of America.
Exactly. It has just lost its crown jewel, so it is highly, highly motivated to extract wealth and rebuild its dominance somewhere else.
So it's like watching two massive multinational corporate mergers collide. Neither side is a blank slate. They both bring these centuries of chaotic, complex, violent corporate culture to the table.
That's a perfect analogy. And Qasim points out that Rome did the exact same thing.
Right.
By the time Rome crossed the English Channel to conquer Britain in 50 AD, they had already spent centuries perfecting their expansionist machine.
Right. Before Julius Caesar or Claudius ever even looked at British soil, Rome had already fought and won 3 brutal Punic wars against Carthage.
Yeah, they had systematically absorbed all those Greek colonies. And it's fascinating because rather than just destroying Greek culture, they mechanically acculturated it.
Which is such a smart PR move, honestly.
It really was. They just rebranded the Greek pantheon. Zeus becomes Jupiter, Aphrodite becomes Venus. It allowed them to unify these sprawling, totally disparate territories under one cultural umbrella.
They had also marched into Jerusalem. General Pompey took Judea, and the Romans deliberately renamed the region Palestine, which they drew from the Philistines.
Right, as a total psychological tactic against the local population.
Yeah, they were actively rewriting the geographic and cultural maps of the Mediterranean.
So when you lay those two CVs side by side, Rome and Britain, Qasim's argument becomes super clear. An empire arriving on a new shore isn't just winging it. They are executing a deeply practiced, centuries-old methodology of absorption.
But how does that practiced methodology actually trigger a conquest on the ground? What's the spark?
Well, Qasim zeroes in on the exact point of entry for the British in Southeast Asia, which is Penang.
Okay.
He He points out that Islam had already been established in the region for centuries at that point. It started with the Kedah Sultanate back in the 12th century.
Which, just for context, is the longest continuous dynasty in Malaysia.
Exactly. So fast forward to the late 18th century, and the Sultan of Kedah is facing the severe existential threat from the Siamese Empire up to the north.
Right, he's backed into a corner.
Totally.
Right.
Facing overwhelming odds, the Sultan makes this massive strategic gamble. He signs a treaty with a British man named Sir Francis Light.
Okay, and what's the deal there?
The deal is simple. The Sultan cedes Penang Island to the British. In return, the British promise military protection against Siam.
But the gamble fails spectacularly, doesn't it?
Oh, completely. The Siamese court is smart. They simply bypass the Sultan and befriend the British directly.
Wow. So the Sultan realizes he's been betrayed.
Yep. He attempts to fight the British to win Penang back, completely loses the war, and ends up losing even more mainland territory, which the British then quickly rebrand as Province Wellesley.
That is brutal. And Qasim draws a heavy line from this exact moment directly back to Rome, right?
He does. He compares the British taking Penang, by exploiting a local conflict in a mutual defense treaty to how the Roman Empire swallowed East Anglia in Britain thousands of years earlier.
Wait, East Anglia?
Yeah. The mechanism is identical. An empire rarely has to kick down the front door with a standing army. Often they are just invited into the foyer to help settle a domestic dispute.
And once they're inside, they just refuse to leave.
Exactly. You ask them to help you with the neighbors, and suddenly they own your house.
But, Qasim makes a very specific distinction here about those two empires that I honestly kind of struggle to accept.
Oh, the territorial versus sentimental thing.
Yeah. He claims British colonialism was purely territorial because they just needed Penang for trade routes, while Roman colonialism was sentimental.
Right.
But, looking at the brutal reality of Rome's expansion, is that a real distinction? Or is that just an empire splitting hairs over how it justifies swallowing up land?
Well, Qasim might argue there is a distinct mechanical difference in how they operated day to day. Rome didn't just want your taxes. They wanted you to literally become Roman.
Right, the whole acculturation thing again.
Yeah, they wanted to replace your gods, your language, your architecture. Britain, at least in the specific context of these early Southeast Asian ports, was heavily focused on the logistics of the East India Company.
So it was just business for them.
Pretty much. They wanted the deep water ports to control the tin and spice trades. The assimilation wasn't the primary goal there. The extraction was.
Okay, but functionally, isn't demanding that a conquered people adopt your identity just like the ultimate form of resource extraction?
That's a fair point.
Whether an empire is there for trade logistics or to spread some grand cultural ideal, the functional outcome on the ground is exactly the same. The local borders are breached, autonomy is lost, the resources flow outward.
And a breached border is never a one-way valve.
No.
If an empire breaks down the door to get out into the world, they've fundamentally destroyed the barrier that keeps the outside world from getting in.
Which brings us to the absolute core of Qasim's longue durée theory, and by far the most controversial part of the source material.
Yeah, this is where it gets very intense.
What happens when that centuries-long loop finally closes? The empire spends hundreds of years extracting wealth and culture, but eventually the flow reverses.
The boomerang comes back.
Exactly. The consequences of the empire arrive right back on its own doorstep.
And as a quick reminder for everyone listening, we are strictly unpacking the creator's argument here to understand his structural view of the world today. We're not endorsing this.
Right, we're just looking at the mechanics of what he's saying.
So according to Qasim, the United Kingdom right now is actively experiencing the exact same systemic collapse as Rome did in 476 AD.
And he points to a couple of specific modern catalysts driving this collapse. He calls them a vacuum of secularism and postmodern skepticism.
Yeah, and to understand what he means by those terms, you really have to look at the psychological state of the host nation.
Okay, break that down for me.
Postmodern skepticism essentially breaks down a society's belief in its own foundational narratives. When a culture spends decades deconstructing its own history, analyzing its flaws, and questioning its core values, it can create a sort of moral and cultural vacuum.
Right, you stop believing in your own story.
Exactly. And Qasim argues that the UK is paralyzed by this deep colonial guilt over historical atrocities. He specifically names the Amritsar massacre in India as a prime example of this.
Okay, so because of that pervasive guilt, Qasim claims the UK has adopted excessively permissive border policies, almost out of a sense of historical charity.
That's his argument, yes.
And this is where the structural vulnerability comes in for him. He argues that by keeping the doors wide open, The UK is taking in populations from highly volatile regions.
He uses Afghanistan as his primary example here.
Right. Populations who carry what he describes as radical forms of Islam.
The mechanism of collapse he's describing here basically relies on a clash of software. He contrasts the incoming demographics with what he calls a modern educated Malaysian.
Interesting comparison.
Well, in Malaysia, he argues, people are educated with a clear ingrained division between church and state. Faith is a private mechanism, totally separate from civic duty.
Okay, I see where he's going.
Right. So he says if you bring that secularized mindset into a Western country, it integrates seamlessly.
But Kasim argues that bringing in refugees who harbor deep-seated angst against the West, maybe due to modern military interventions or historical grievances, creates severe fragmentation.
Exactly. When highly dogmatic groups enter society that's already suffering from that vacuum of secularism, they easily overpower the skeptical, guilt-ridden host culture.
And he claims this leads to these ideological ghettos or mini caliphates within the UK, where the values of the incomers completely reject the legal and social norms of the nation.
And to really illustrate the severity of this vulnerability, Kasim uses a very visceral analogy.
Oh, yeah, the attic comparison.
Yes. He compares a nation operating with open borders to a severe addict.
Wait, I mean, comparing a nation's border policy to a sex addict going on late night websites or like an alcoholic stepping into a pub, that is a massive escalation in rhetoric.
It's huge.
Is he suggesting the UK is literally addicted to open borders, or is he just making a point about impulse control?
It's entirely about impulse control and the total absence of boundaries. An addict in the throes of their addiction cannot regulate what they let into their system.
Right, they have no defense.
Zero self-defense mechanisms. Kasim is arguing that a nation dealing with colonial guilt and postmodern skepticism has basically lost its geopolitical immune system.
Wow.
So just like an addict in the early fragile stages of recovery, he believes a nation must first build sobriety through uncompromising, incredibly strict boundaries.
Which is why he actually praises Poland for this.
He does, yeah. He points to Poland's highly restrictive approach to immigration as this model of national sobriety.
Right.
His argument is that you have to shut the doors, build up internal resilience, and a unified cultural identity first. And only after you have established that solid foundation can you safely, moderately interact with the outside world again.
Okay, so setting aside the intense political heat of those statements for a second, the underlying structural argument here is really about the rebound effect of empires.
Yes, the boomerang.
Right. An expanding empire requires extreme fluidity. It normalizes erasing borders on a map to move its armies, establish trade routes, and just push its culture outward.
And that massive infrastructure of global movement that Britain built to extract wealth from its colonies. I mean, the shipping lanes, the administrative ties, even the widespread imposition of the English language itself.
Yeah.
That infrastructure does not just disappear when the empire's power wanes. It becomes the exact pathway for the colonized world to flow back into the imperial center.
Rome did the same thing, right? They built these magnificent, totally unprecedented road networks to conquer the known world.
Right.
But eventually the world used those exact same roads to march right back into the heart of Rome.
It's a massive historical boomerang.
Yeah. You throw your influence out across the globe for centuries, destroying boundaries as you go. But when your outward momentum finally stops, you no longer have the cultural or physical walls required to stop the boomerang from hitting you when it returns.
And this is where the longue durée framework is so crucial. It's designed to remove the surprise from that impact.
How do you mean?
Well, when you view history as this centuries-long loop, the collapse of an empire isn't some sudden, inexplicable tragedy, right? It is the predictable, almost mechanical result of its own expansion.
Which begs a huge question for me. Why is Kasim taking the time to map out these massive, deeply controversial loops of history?
That's the most surprising part. His ultimate goal isn't just to debate geopolitics on YouTube. He actually presents this entire framework as a tool for mental health.
Wait, really? Mental health?
Yeah. In the context of the longue durée, it actually makes a profound amount of sense. Think about it. We are currently living in a media environment that is essentially designed to induce panic.
Oh, 100%. If you only look at the short term, like the manic 24-hour news cycle, the endless online drama, the outrage of the week, you become entirely reactive.
Exactly.
Every single political event or social shift feels like this unprecedented existential crisis.
You get caught up in the pure sensation of the moment. And that constant state of alarm leads to pervasive anxiety and really societal depression.
So Kasim's argument is that Adopting the longue durée perspective allows you to sort of detach.
Yes. You recognize that we are simply living through one specific phase of a massive historical machine, a machine that has cycled through ancient Java, the Mediterranean with Rome, and the heights of the British Empire.
It totally changes your relationship to the news. Instead of panicking at the smoke coming out of the engine, you start to understand how the gears of human civilization are actually turning.
Right. History becomes a grounding mechanism.
Yeah, it allows you to look at the world rationally. You're analyzing causes and effects rather than just reacting emotionally to the symptoms of the day. I mean, context is the ultimate antidote to panic.
Exactly. By zooming out, we can see the patterns. And if we can see the patterns, we can ask much better questions about the future.
And that leaves us with a profound, maybe even a little unsettling thought for you to consider as we wrap up. If empires truly operate on these massive, centuries-long loops of expansion, absorption, and eventual reverse colonization, we have to look at what we are doing today.
Right. The physical land grabs of the 18th century might be over, but what are the subtle seeds being planted right now?
Exactly. What are the new territories we are aggressively colonizing today?
It's not islands anymore.
No. Look at the digital, technological, and economic realms. We are extracting massive data sets from around the globe. We're building global surveillance infrastructures and algorithmic networks that cross every single border on Earth.
It's totally borderless.
Right. So if Kasim's historical loop holds true, what does the reverse colonization of those digital territories look like? 500 years from now, when the algorithms and the global tech infrastructure we built to expand our influence inevitably flow back to reshape us, what will our descendants be facing?
It's a huge question.
It is. Because history isn't just a collection of artifacts in a museum. It's a continuous tectonic shift. And the ground is always moving beneath our feet.